As you may already know, compression provides a way of sort of averaging out the volume of a sound. What we can do with compressors is to set a threshold, and above that we can start to reduce volume. And what that means is that the dynamic range of a sound, literally the distance, if you like, between its quietest and loudest moments, is brought closer together. And as a result, we end up with a more consistent average volume. Now, what we're going to do within this chapter is to discover that that is not the same as regulating the performance volume of a particular track. Let's take an example, as we're going to within this project, which is that we've got a piano and a vocal within a kind of piano ballady kind of a project. And what we want to do is to make sure that there is a sort of natural volume performance to the way that the vocal sits within this track. And we're going to discover that we can't do that with compression alone. Here is the track as it sits right now, with some EQ on the vocal, but absolutely no dynamics processing, and no volume automation either. So effectively, from a volume perspective, this is literally just as the vocal has been performed.
Nothing makes sense to me like you. You make it all real, so real.
Okay, so we've got a kind of section of verse and pre-chorus within this particular song. Okay, so let's suppose what I wanted to do was to say, okay, well, there are some phrases within this project that feel a little bit too quiet relative to the piano and bass, and others that maybe feel a little bit too strong. Is there a way that what I can do is to use compression to average out level enough so that the sort of performance of this vocal feels like it's more under control? Well, yes and no. Definitely some compression on this vocal is a good idea, and some overall sort of effective averaging out the volume of it, I think, will help it sit within the mix. But that isn't going to be the same as then massaging exactly how we move from one volume to another to make sure that the overall flow of the track feels correct. So what I'm going to do is to punch the dynamics section of the SSL native channel strip plugin, which is giving me both EQ and dynamics control. And what I'm then going to do is to begin to compress the signal so that we're getting volume under control a little bit more than we have right now. So of course that's going to be a combination of the threshold point and the ratio that we're using. So I'm going to just sort of set these so we can begin to see compression being introduced. And remember, anything above the threshold point is going to be compressed. And overall, from an output point of view, if I suddenly discover that the compression is turning the volume down too much, I can boost it here.
Nothing makes sense to me like you. Make it all real, so real. Give me everything that money can buy. Set my world on fire, yeah. You make me strong, don't have to try. You make it all better.
Okay, so to an extent that's working. What compression does is to set a threshold, and as the vocal gets louder and exceeds that threshold, its volume is regulated, and definitely that feels punchier and stronger and fuller for the fact that it's being compressed. But let's take this idea of compression controlling volume and output volume to the most extreme example. In compression, we already know that if a signal exceeds the threshold point, it becomes compressed. And the ratio controls how much it becomes compressed. In other words, the higher the ratio amount, the more we're squeezing volume downwards. So it stands to reason that if I turn ratio up to infinity to 1, so that effectively above the threshold point, the signal isn't allowed to get any louder, and if I take the threshold point to a point within the vocal performance where every single part of the vocal is being compressed, we should end up with this kind of brick wall effect where the volume is being completely regulated. Effectively, it's just one volume the whole way through. Let's have a listen to how that sounds.
Nothing makes sense to me like you.
it doesn't make it all better. It sounds horrible. And the reason it sounds horrible is because, remember, every single part of this vocal performance, including all of the gaps between the phrases, are now being compressed. So, of course, when we get a lot of volume, the amount of squeeze on that vocal is enormous. And when we get almost no volume, effectively what we're getting is all of the sort of noise floor, all of the kind of hiss of the mic and the channel and the various things that have gone into the performance of capturing this vocal much louder. So clearly, compression and volume management are not the same thing. So what we need to do is to come back to a point where the threshold felt about right, and that what we were doing was finding a nice sort of sweet spot in terms of sort of averaging out the volume a little bit more. And then we're going to need volume automation to just make sure that we're making sure that the vocal sort of feels like it's progressing through the track in a way that feels more musical. The two things can't be achieved with one automated process like compression. So let's just get the compression settings right, and then we'll see how we can sort of just manage that with volume automation instead.
Nothing makes sense to me like you. You make it all real, so real.
Okay, so I'm going to go with these settings. I've set threshold and ratio where I want them to be. What I need to do now is I need to think about exactly how I want the performance of this vocal to be sort of realized from one part of a phrase to the next. Now, up to a point, the actual waveform of the vocal can help me here. I can see, and I know because we've played it through a few times, that the sort of greatest intensity of this vocal comes at the end, and I can see that represented in the waveform, not just in terms of the height of it, but the sort of intensity through the shape. Whereas earlier on, where we've got a sort of more natural dynamic, not only is each individual sort of blob of the waveform a little bit less tall, showing its overall volume, but I can sort of see that the natural decay of individual words just falls away a little bit more. And that's kind of what I mean in terms of the sort of the way that compression isn't going to be our friend here. What we're going to need, if we want the ends of those phrases just to feel a little bit more natural, is to maybe draw in those changes with volume automation instead. And of course, I can regulate the overall volume here by simply just taking the default line up or down, depending on whether or not I think the vocal is too loud or too quiet. So what we're going to do is to focus on the verse section and just think about whether or not we can make this feel a bit more natural using volume automation.
Nothing makes sense to me like you.
So here's a good example of a word that maybe feels like it would benefit from a little bit more of a push. So the U on this particular lyric definitely feels like overall it could come up a little bit. I'm going to use Logic's marquee tool to draw a little box around that in one note. And then what I've got a chance to do, having clicked on it with the pointer tool, is simply just kind of to raise this line. Now, if you're not working with the Logic, exactly the same tools are available in different workstations. And at the end of the day, all I've done really is to create a few nodes around this particular note in order for us to be able to then sort of control its volume. So I want that word to be louder, but also as it decays, I want to push up its volume. So as it falls away, I'm sort of artificially making it get louder. Now, I'm only sort of adding about 1.5 dB, so this looks like quite an extreme volume rise, but it's only a little bit. It's just allowing us to have that note be present in the mix for a bit longer.
Nothing makes sense to me like you. You make it all real, so real.
So we've got a couple of other opportunities to do something similar. Again, this time I'm just literally going to draw points around here. I want this note to feel a bit louder. And again, I'm going to repeat the same trick through the end of that. So we're just pushing that volume. And again, this word here on the end definitely feels like we're losing it as we move into the next stage of the song. Now, very quickly, when you start adding volume automation, you'll end up with a pretty dynamic line, because the moment you begin this process, your ear will become really attuned to words that feel like they're a little loud, which maybe need attenuating a little bit, and others that feel like they're falling away a little bit more than they should. I'm willing to bet that that probably needs a little bit of a push there as well. And so don't be afraid if suddenly it looks like you're intervening a lot in terms of the way that volume automation is going to help you sort of create the performance that you're looking for. Actually, if you close your eyes and listen back, that's going to be the best test of whether or not you're creating this kind of natural volume line.
Nothing makes sense to me make it all real, so real.
And of course, the other huge advantage of volume automation over compression is that if you've got artifacts or little moments within the vocal that you want to turn down, little mouth noises or clicks or pops or little bits of noise that have just been recorded, then of course you can use volume automation to regulate those too. Now you might be thinking, well, I could just go through with a pair of scissors and chop up this region. And yep, to an extent you can absolutely do that if you want to. But sometimes keeping the mic open so that we're just kind of getting that sense of a sort of warm performance and that it's sort of the singer is in the room with us, making us sort of feel this performance. Sometimes turning the volume down on those things rather than completely taking volume out altogether is a nicer way of sort of creating a more human musical performance. So what we've seen within this chapter is that volume compression is not the same as volume automation, that we can't simply sort of set and forget a series of controls within a compressor that are going to just make sense the whole way through a project. And imagine within this song if I suddenly decided that I needed a string arrangement or drums or acoustic guitar in the next section of the song. Suddenly the volume line, which is working nicely against just piano in the verse, is going to be completely drowned by the arrival of new musical elements. And at that point, turning the volume up rather than trying somehow to make a compression setting that works in both sections of the song is going to be a much better approach.